So to start, we're in chapter 6, verse 1. It says, "Now it happened on the second Sabbath after the first, that he went through the grain fields. And his disciples plucked the heads of the grain and ate them, rubbing them in their hands." What exactly does the second Sabbath after the first mean? I don't know, and I've come to believe I don't think anyone does. I've done a lot of reading on that one and know second Sabbath after the first. So Luke obviously knew what he was talking about. We're the only ones who don't. But obviously it's on a Sabbath. That's all that matters. It is a Sabbath, and they're going through the grain fields, and they are plucking the heads of the grain, and they're eating them as they go. If you're a note taker, you might want to write it in your notes, or you could flip over and look, but it's Deuteronomy 23, and I want to say it's verse 25. It says, "When you come into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the heads with your hand, but you shall not use a sickle or on your neighbor's standing grain." In the previous verse, it talks about if you go into a vineyard, you can eat the grapes to your fill at your pleasure, but you should not put it in a container. And so this was the idea, was that simply you weren't supposed to be collecting your neighbor's food, but you could eat if you were hungry. You're just walking through the field, you grab an apple off the tree, have a snack. You're not harvesting, you're just feeling what you could eat right there on the travel. So that's what they were doing. Nothing wrong with that. But in verse 2, some of the Pharisees said to them, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" And so by this point in time, the rabbis had broken down Sabbath law into 39 categories, and each of those 39 categories had 6 subcategories. And so they broke down the 39 main things that you are not allowed to do, and then 6 subcategories for each of those, contextually and in different situations, how it was going to look. And so I had some fun examples here of some Sabbath rules. I've shared some of the same ones over and over again, and so some of you might miss out on those, but others of you probably heard me use those examples 3, 4, 5, 20 times. But let's see here. Adding fresh water to a vase of cut flowers. You're not allowed to do that on the Sabbath because you're sowing or any activity that causes plants to grow more. You are helping plants grow. You can't do that on the Sabbath. Therefore, you may not water your plants on the Sabbath. Pretty simple. You're not allowed to make a bouquet of flowers on the Sabbath because that's making a sheaf. You know, when you gather the stuff together. And you have to see, this is the way things started, was God says don't work. Well, what is work? And these are typical, Jewish rabbinical, what is work? And they start talking about, well, what's work? Well, I mean, you can't sow. You're not supposed to go out and sow the fields. You're not going to plant. Okay. And you're not supposed to reap the heart. You're not supposed to cut down the stuff. Well, what if you cut it yesterday? Well, you're not supposed to gather it into sheaves, right? You're not supposed to do work. You're not supposed to grind it. You're not supposed to thresh it. You're not supposed to winnow it, which is the grinding to get the husk off, threshing to kind of separate them, and winnowing is the blowing to kind of blow the husk away. But then they start saying, well, what is making a sheaf? Well, obviously a bouquet of flowers is a sheaf because you're gathering plants together. So can't do it. It's making a sheaf. Separating good fruit from spoiled fruit is considered winnowing or selecting / sifting. So the idea with this is that you're not allowed to even separate like your foods like you're about to eat that night, right? You're not supposed to take the bad ones and stick them over here and the good ones. That has to be done the day before. So if you need to separate the good grapes from the bad grapes or whatever, you're not allowed to debone your fish. You're not allowed. That's why we're gefilte fish are these fish that they've already deboned and done this stuff, and it's a real popular Jewish food, gefilte fish. Another one is brushing dried mud from your boots or your clothes, because that's grinding, because you're taking the stuff and you're moving it. You're allowed to spit on a rock, but you can't spit on the ground because that's plowing, because the ball of spit will roll and pick up the dirt. So this is the idea of how what was simple, right? Don't cut the grain, okay? Don't plant new seeds. That makes sense. Don't go to the fields and work. But then they started saying, well, but does that mean this? Does that mean that? You cannot cut your hair or your nails, right? Because that's shearing. You're not allowed to shear. One of the things they said was not only were you not allowed to do the axe, but you are not allowed to do any act which would likely lead you to breaking a rule, which is why you're not allowed to look in the mirror on the Sabbath. For if a woman looked in the mirror and saw a gray hair, she would be tempted to pluck it, and that would be harvesting. So this is the idea. I mean, I'm just showing you more of these Sabbath laws, so maybe you'll hear a few new ones to get an idea of this is what happens when man takes religion and starts defining it and defining the definitions of it. You can't apply makeup on the Sabbath because that's dying, right? Because again, you go back to the original rules where you couldn't make wool clothing or you couldn't make a blanket and then dye the blanket. Well, dyeing that's someone's face. Can't braid hair, that's weaving. So you see the ties now between these everyday actions that are just, they don't hurt anything, but they're tying them to the actual actions of work. Drawing blood for a blood test, that would be considered slaughtering because you're letting the blood out of the animal. And they would let the blood out of all their animals when they kill anything. They have to let all the blood come out. Let's see here. Sharpening a pencil. Can't do that because you're cutting and shaping the size and to make it better. So you're not allowed to improve a product on the Sabbath. You cannot, re-engineer something. So sharpening a pencil, that's off. Drawing, painting, or typing. Any kind of writing that would be durable and last is considered creating. You're not allowed to create on the Sabbath. But there's a solution to this. You see, for one, you're only allowed to write 2 letters. That is what the rabbis came up with. You could write 2 letters, no more. But you can use unlimited punctuation. So they found very creative ways to use punctuation to get their points across. Also, if you're a doctor and someone is ill and you need to write a prescription or write orders for your nurse, you see, what is writing? Well, it has to be lasting. So if it's not lasting, is it not writing? No, if it's not lasting, it's not writing. Therefore, the Shabbat pen. They have Shabbat pens that use a disappearing ink that after about 4 days, the ink disappears. So therefore, you're not really writing. And so you can write your orders to the nurse or to whoever. They can photocopy them the day after when Shabbat's over. Now you can photocopy that. That'll last, but the original writing will disappear into infinity and beyond. And so these, again, are their solutions. Not only did they come up with crazy rules, but then they came up with crazy solutions to get around their rules. I mean, it's just hilarious where it's like, let's just make this the most hard thing to do, and then let's find a loophole. And then let's get another, okay, just a few more. Let's see here. Tearing through lettering on a package. That's erasing, or I guess some of these I pulled off of a list I found. Opening an umbrella or unfolding a screen is building. So you can't do that. I guess I'll repeat one that many of you are familiar with, which is you're not allowed to push a stroller outside of your home. Inside your home is okay, but outside of your home is a no-go. And so that said, they talked about how if you lived in the city streets of Jerusalem and you went down to the end of your alley and you put a beam up, you've now extended your home, and anything inside of the beam is now your home. So you can walk it down from there. I guess you can push a stroller, but you can only push it that Sabbath day journey. And so there's these little things where, well, then if you can extend what your boundaries of your property are, then you can go that 2,000 cubits beyond that point. And so all these crazy rules. You cannot smoke a cigarette or use a telephone because that's considered kindling a fire. Because anything that uses electricity at all, so that would include switching on and off an electronic light. Because anything that creates an electronic circuit, that's creating fire. And therefore, you can't do anything electricity. So my oven and my refrigerator at home are Samsungs. And Samsung products typically have a Shabbat mode. So for instance, if I set my refrigerator up on Shabbat mode, the refrigerator light will stay on during Shabbat hours. So even if I close my refrigerator door, the light stays on. And it was activated before Shabbat started. That way when I opened the door, I didn't activate the light was already on. If you cannot afford a refrigerator with Shabbat mode, the advice of the rabbis is use some masking tape to just tape the little button that keeps the light on, the little activator button. And that way, you're not activating the light during Shabbat. Now it's okay. Now God's happy. Before, God would have been angry if your refrigerator light turned on. But now you are following Shabbat. They've made telephones now that they somehow don't create a new circuit and they like piggyback on another circuit, and somehow that's not breaking the law because it's not creating a new circuit, it's piggybacking on a pre-existing circuit. I think the last on my list, not the best, but setting or winding a clock, that's finishing something off or completing a project. They have these interesting views on these things. I think the best one though, right, is the Shabbat Goy, or Shabbat Goy. A Goy is a word for Gentile. Goyim, that's us, we're the Gentiles. So your Shabbat Gentile, you will go to Jerusalem or you go places in Israel and you'll see advertisements in the windows of like a Muslim or an Arab shop, and you can go there and hire yourself a Shabbat Goy, which is your Gentile boy. And the idea is your Sabbath Gentile, they will go and do whatever you're not allowed to do for you. So that way, if you need to get some work done on the Sabbath, but you can't do it, you just hire a Gentile to do it for you. And then everything is done, and God is happy. This is the kind of stuff that was already in the works in Jesus' time. There's obviously a bunch of modern stuff that we're looking at right now. But I'm painting the picture because the next two stories, really the only two stories, other than the calling of the 12 we're getting tonight, both revolve around the Sabbath. And so they're getting frustrated because the disciples were plucking the heads of grain, which was okay. But let's see if I can remember. I've seen people list up to 4 Sabbath violations. They plucked the grain. They harvested. They threshed it in their hands. So they're grinding in their hands. And then the winnowing and the threshing, the idea is they're getting rid of, they blow on it, that's winnowing. And as they get the chaff, the outer husk off of the stuff so they can just chew on the wheat, that's what and they prepared a meal too. So they cooked, so this is what the Pharisees are trying to say. Verse 3 says, "But Jesus answered them and said, 'Have you not read this? What David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him?' Verse 4, how he went into the house of God, and he took and ate the showbread, and also gave some to those who he was with, which is not lawful for anyone but the priest to eat. And he said to them, 'The Son of Man is also the Lord of the Sabbath.'" Now, something, I don't know how many of you would think about this, but do not confuse Lord of the Sabbath with Lord Sabaoth, with an O in there. You see that in Martin Luther's A Mighty Fortress. Lord Sabaoth is his name. That is Lord of Hosts in Hebrew. So when you see Lord of Hosts, that's Lord Sabaoth with an O in it. Yes, very much so for people asking questions in the back. And so we see that he's Lord of the Sabbath. And they need to understand that he's trying to show them what the Sabbath was all about. See, David, when he went to the tabernacle and he ate of that showbread, it was unlawful. That was illegal for anyone other than the priests to eat. For 1 week at the table of presence, there was 12 loaves of bread that represented the 12 tribes in the tabernacle, later to be in the temple. And every week, they would replace it. Every Sabbath, they would replace it with fresh bread. And the priests serving, they were allowed to eat that bread, the week-old bread. No one else was allowed to eat it. But David, on the run from Saul, goes up to the tabernacle, asks if they have any weapons. They give him the sword of Goliath, so he carries that with him. And he goes and he says, "Well, we're starving. You have anything to eat?" Well, they say, "We only have the bread of the table of presence." And David's like, "Just give it to me. We're gonna faint in the wilderness and die if we don't get something to eat." This is all 1 Samuel 21. So if you want your little note on the side of that so you know where to flip for the future, 1 Samuel 21 verse 6 is specifically where he requests the bread. But this is where we find a general principle that is helpful, but also could easily be taken out of context and misused. Which was the principle that we have God's ceremonial law. We have these are traditions and practices of how they were supposed to do church. We don't have a lot of that in the Christian church today. The only thing that comes to mind right now is actually like 1 Corinthians 14, when it talks a little bit about like speaking in tongues with interpretation and prophecy then being judged. And like, I mean, there's some church order given there, right? A little bit of how we do church, not so much sin, not sin. And so here, David's life was on the line, and they realized that they were able to look past some of their order and the ceremonial law in order to preserve life. I'll mention it maybe again, or I'll just mention it now. In the next story with the Sabbath and the healing, you see, they believed that certain things could be healed on the Sabbath, but certain things should not be. One thing that was allowed on the Sabbath was circumcision. They would allow someone to be circumcised on the 8th day. That's when they had to do it, if the 8th day was on the Sabbath. Because they felt like circumcision to the Jew was such a big deal. And we see that in Acts, we see that in Galatians, we see that other places in the New Testament, how to the Jew that was such an important tradition and ritual and rite that they would even break the Sabbath and perform a medical procedure because it was so important to them. Well, sometimes we will find in these interesting situations, and I think one of the best examples we can give is in today with COVID, when we were trying to wrestle with Romans 13 and with Titus and with Peter and all the verses concerning our obedience to the governing authorities. And how long did that last until at some point maybe we had to decide, well, there's a place where I need to be obedient to God and his people. And this was one of those examples I gave some people because I said, well, I'm not just going to take this lightly. Like, I don't just get to disobey the governor just because I don't like something. Or I disagree. Yeah, my obedience has nothing to do with me agreeing with it or not. It has to do with God told me, therefore I do. But if it got to the point where you start to see the spiritual health of people suffer, you watch people backslide into sin, you watch the spiritual health of the church deteriorate because people are lacking that fellowship that we so desperately need, at some point you say, Lord, I am thinking that there's a greater importance over here. Something else that you hold as important is falling apart. And I know you said this, but you've also told us to do all this. And so at this point, I think, Lord, I need to go this way and obey. I think the other example that's very practical is when we tell the story, well, not story, but the example of lying. See, lying's sin, and lying's always sin. And everyone wants an excuse to tell a lie and have it not be sin. Well, if my wife asked me if she looks fat in this dress, I was like, well, it's a lie. Lies are lies. You're not supposed to lie. Now, you're not trying to get punched either. But the thing is that we want excuses to lie. And then there's these crazy scenarios we give. Well, what if there was a murderer and they wanted to know where the kids were hiding from the children's ministry because they were going to execute everyone in the church? You know what? Go ahead and lie at that point if the Lord leads you. I'm just going to be honest. Like, when you're preserving life from wickedness, by deceiving a wicked person who wants to do a wicked thing, I have a peace in my heart that God will look past that lie. We see the midwives in Egypt who are like, man, we can't keep up with those Hebrew women. By the time we get there, the baby's already born and we can't, because they were supposed to kill the babies. The midwives were supposed to get there when the women were delivering and kill the babies. And they just tell Pharaoh, well, them Hebrew women, they just pop those babies out and we can't stop them. There are scenarios like with Rahab and the 2 spies. The spies were going to be killed. Rahab lies about the spies. So preserving life, we're not talking about like being at odds with your spouse because you didn't tell the truth or you're trying to avoid telling the truth, but life and death, real serious things. And so here Jesus just gives the example, backing up to where David ate the showbread. He did something unlawful on the Sabbath, or unlawful, but it was for a greater good. And these guys are just trying to eat. They're not trying to make money. They're not out there trying to run a business. They're not trying to break the Sabbath. They were just taking a handful of grain, grinding it up and popping it in their mouth. And he's trying to point out to the Pharisees that the whole point of the Sabbath had been lost at this point. In fact, the first mention we really see of the Sabbath in the book of Numbers, it's before the 10 Commandments. Well, it's not, I guess Numbers isn't before the 10 Commandments, no, it's before Numbers. In Exodus, where we see it says that the Sabbath's for your sake. I was thinking about the guy in the sticks in Numbers. But it was a time of rest for your sake. God says, I did it for you, that you would rest, that you would take time for me, not so that you would have all these rules to follow. I'm trying to give you guys a break so you guys don't work yourself to death. And yet you guys turn this into some heavy rule thing. Verse 6 now, the other instance says, now it happened on the Sabbath also that he entered the synagogue and taught, and a man was there whose right hand was withered. What is withered? Well, I mean, withered is basically when you don't have the blood flow and the supply, the atrophy and whatnot that happens where someone's hand, it kind of shrivels up. And I think we've all seen people throughout our lives who have a hand that is usually cocked back and very tight because it constricts and it's not full, long, and healthy and able to move. One commentator points out that many of us, whether visible or not, have parts of us that have become withered because they've not been treated correctly or they've been injured by something internally or externally. Not so much a physical withering, but a spiritual one or an emotional one. An injury that we carry with us. And so Jesus sees this man and he wants to help him. It says the scribes and Pharisees watched Jesus closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. You see, healing this withered man didn't have to happen right then. Healing on the Sabbath, here were the rules. You could pull out a splinter if it was in your eye, but not if it was in your finger or in your foot or in your hip or whatever. In your eye, you could pull that out. Nothing else as far as splinters are concerned. If you cut yourself, you were allowed to stop the bleeding, but you could not stitch it. You could just stop the blood flow, but you could not perform any surgery until after Sabbath was over. You could only just, compress. Put the tourniquet on, but wait till Sabbath's over before we start actually stitching this thing up and getting to it. Thankfully, you were allowed to give birth on the Sabbath. They didn't make you wait. But there were certain things that were allowed and certain things that weren't. And essentially, they did permit life and death procedures. If someone would die, you could save the life, but no more than that. And if it was anything that wasn't life or death, you got put on the non-essential list and you had to wait until after Sabbath was over. These guys knew Jesus would want to heal this man. It seems as if, we don't know, that they may have lured the guy there, brought him there. Maybe it was the man's custom to be there. But they were expecting that Jesus was going to come and want to heal this guy. And they wanted to make an accusation against him. That word accusation in the Greek is kategoria. It's where we get category from. What's fascinating is they categorized Jesus' desire to heal as sin because he was doing the healing on the Sabbath. And yet, they were plotting and trying to do a setup so that they could come up with an accusation to kill Jesus. This was not evil to do on the Sabbath. So healing on the Sabbath was bad, but setting someone up to murder them, good. So just interesting to see, you can categorize stuff. And for what it's worth, Satan's really good at that. He helps us to categorize things like these sins are bad sins. These sins are permissible sins because I've got a good reason. These things are this way. Those things are that way. I'm this kind of a sinner, but that's that kind of a sinner. And so putting things into these categories. Verse 8, but he knew their thoughts and said to the men who had the withered hand, arise and stand here. And he arose and stood. And Jesus said to him, I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy? You see, for Jesus, to not heal the man would have been evil. Not that we're accusing Jesus of being close to doing evil, but the idea was, and I believe in Jesus' mind and heart, when you have the ability, you have the availability, you're available and able, and you choose not to do that which you could have done. That is what we call those sins of omission. You didn't do anything wrong. It's just you didn't do the right thing that you had the full capability to do. For Jesus, it would have been sin to have left a good man seeking healing and not giving it to him. There's other scenarios in other places, but they just knew this is what Jesus was going to show up. This is what Jesus was going to do. And so it says, when he looked around at them all, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. Now, this is where there's some interesting stuff we want to piece in here. If you're a note taker or a note writer, right there next to verse 10 where it says he looked around, in Mark 3:5, it says he looked around with anger. So it says Jesus looks around with anger at these Pharisees. He's upset because he knows exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to take advantage of this poor man. They're trying to accuse him of wickedness because they know he's going to heal on the Sabbath, yet they are trying to plot a murder on the Sabbath, and they see nothing wrong with it. So often we can get caught up in these situations where we just don't see it because we think our sins are a little bit cleaner than everyone else's. These categories we mentioned from verse 7, that, well, this is okay, but that's not okay. You know, I mentioned this morning, right? The difference between, you know, it's one thing to say, well, I don't do drugs, right? But you don't do prayer either. And so what is God going to judge you for? When you know better and you know what you ought to do, are we doing those things that we should be doing? Here, Jesus is angry. And I think this is a big thing. The anger of Jesus. We only see this a few times where Jesus is written as being angry. I liked how I had heard this put. I even wrote it down here. Sometimes anger is the only proper moral response to a situation. There are some things in this world that are wicked, and anger is the only proper moral response. And I would even dare to say not being angry would probably be sin. Because we are told, right, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all wisdom, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and the fear of the Lord is to hate evil. There are certain things that are wicked, and sometimes I believe we can be very apathetic and kind of laid back about stuff that truly is bad. And we should be upset about it. Like when we see people being mistreated, we should be upset about it. When we see bad things happening, we should actually get angry. I heard a story about what you might call righteous anger. And I thought it was a good example of a story where you get angry over bad people doing bad things. Pastor Don McClure, for people who do the Tuesday nights, he did one of our messages, and he's one of my favorite pastors. I love that guy. And he was saying that when his boys were young, that one day, somewhere along the line, down in the neighborhood, some guy invites the boys on into the house. And there in the house, this guy begins to show them these child pornography images. And he's essentially trying to, groom these boys. And the boys end up bolting and getting out of there. So Don says, all right, they come home, they tell their dad what happened. So Don says, well, hop in the car. They hop in the car. He says, drive, take me where we go. He says, where's the house? They point at the house, and their dad said, thank you. So Dad drives home, drops the boys off, goes inside. He gets the phone, calls the police. He says, hello? They're like, yes. He's like, hey, here's the address, 12345, 5th Street. There's going to be a murder. And he hung up the phone. And he goes, he starts driving there. He says he gets to the house, he knocks on the door. He says, the guy opens the door. He goes, the guy was a lot bigger than I was expecting. But he was kind of a scrappy guy as a young kid. He had fought quite a bit as a youth. So he said he took the guy, he literally grabs him by the shirt and throws him onto the front lawn. He jumps on top of him and starts punching him. He goes, and I think that guy was just shocked because he was so much bigger than me. He should have beat me up. But I think he was so stunned that I just showed up and did this. And he said, but thankfully I hear the sirens coming. And so the police arrived. They pulled me off. They said, we're both in handcuffs. He goes, I explained to the police what happened. They went inside. They found all the stuff there in the living room. The police said it was pretty straightforward. They took my handcuffs off and they said, you can go. They said, matter of fact, we got a couple of addresses we could give you if you'd like, because there's things you can do that we can't do. But the point is that he was infuriated over the horrible thing that happened. But sometimes it can be easy for us to turn a blind eye to evil. When there is evil out there that people do need to speak out for, because there isn't anyone else who's going to speak out for the defenseless people. And that's what Jesus does here. He sees this man with a withered hand. These guys are abusive, these leaders who, oh, you can't heal on the Sabbath, you can't this or that. So Jesus is angry. He's looking around infuriated with this setup they're trying to do. And he looks to the man and says, stretch out your hand. And his hand is restored. And once again, these miracles we read of in the New Testament, it's not like he added half an inch of length to the guy's leg. We're talking about a withered hand is now fully restored. I don't know if you hear the joints pop. I don't know, what does it look like? What does it sound like when this hand comes back and is ready to use? But they, verse 11, were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. A man gets healed, but they're not happy because it didn't fit, their view of religion. And so it says in verse 12, now it came to pass in those days that he went up on a mountain to pray and continued to pray all night to God. And when it was day, he called the disciples to himself. And from them he chose 12, whom he named apostles. Apostle simply means sent out one. That's what it means. You're sent out with a commission. I give you a job. I send you out. Whoever sends you out with the job is also going to enable you to get the job done. And so he gives them the power to cast out demons and all this stuff we will see later on. He's on Mount Arbel. It's a big mountain. One way we know that is because he went out to the mountain. It's not a mountain, it's the mountain. And really in the Galilee region, there's a couple others you could kind of argue, but there's just one that just stands out as this impressive mountain. I got to go up there for the first time this last Israel trip, and it's just an amazing view. My plan is to try and sneak up there before sunrise sometime in the near future here and try and watch the sunrise over the Galilee from the top of Arbel. But beautiful mountain. And he calls the apostles. And so I want to go through this list and, just quickly take a peek because you've got 12 guys. He didn't pick them because of who they were. He picked them because he knew who they'd become. 11 of them are Galileans. These guys, they weren't great. They weren't amazing. They didn't have a lot of skills. They didn't have a lot of things. They didn't have a lot of things to offer. But Jesus knew who they'd become. And Jesus wanted to pick these guys because he knew what potential they had. Peter is going to deny him 3 times. Peter's going to walk out in the water, but he's going to take a swan dive into the water. Peter's going to be the one who says, you're not allowed to wash my feet. Peter's going to be the one who tells him, but Lord, I've never eaten an unclean thing when he lowers down the sheet in the book of Acts. Peter's the one who Paul's going to have to rebuke later on at Antioch. Peter's going to have lots of mistakes. But Peter's also going to be the one who's going to be crucified upside down because he refused to be crucified like his Lord. Out of all the apostles, 10 out of the 12 were all martyred. They were all killed, and none of them died a happy, easy faith. You got Peter, who was crucified upside down, and then you've got his brother Andrew, who was crucified on an X-shaped cross. So you can hear like a cross of Andrew. Sometimes you'll see these like crosses that are more of an X than the T we're traditionally used to. You've got James and John. James is the first one martyred. The apostle James is the one he's killed in Acts chapter 12. So he's the first martyr out of the apostles. And then you have John. John is the only one who goes to old age. He doesn't get martyred. He lives on. That doesn't stop people from boiling him in oil, though. So John was boiled in oil, and he survived. And I don't know what's worse, boiling in oil and dying, or boiling in oil and surviving. To live up to be over 100 years old after experiencing this situation. The next we see in verse 14 is Philip and Bartholomew. Philip was crucified, which out of all these guys was one of the more tamer deaths. Bartholomew was skinned alive and then crucified, or skinned while crucified. It's kind of hard to understand exactly how it went. When I looked up these pictures, this was actually one of the least graphic photos I could find. Not photos, but artistic renderings of it. It wasn't quite as bad because they're only starting to skin him alive in this picture. But truly, that he was skinned alive for his faith. Matthew traveled on down to India, where he was pinned into the ground. They nail him 1, 2, 3, 4 hands and feet into the ground, and then he was beheaded. Thomas Sorry, not to Matthew, sorry. That was Thomas goes to India. That was my mistake. Thomas goes to India, and he was hit through the spear. James. Oh, Bartholomew, I forgot to mention. Bartholomew is the one also known as Nathaniel. So in John chapter 1, you see Nathaniel under the fig tree. That's Bartholomew. I'll try and catch the rest of these guys who have the multiple name things. Matthew's also Levi. We have James, the son of Alphaeus, who's also known as James the Less. People think it could be that he's younger, more than likely that he was just smaller, like Big James, Little James. And so he was beaten to death. Then you have Simon called the Zealot. There was the group called the Zealots. He was sawn in half. And it's pretty intense what these guys went through. He was called a zealot because the zealots were the ones who would do anything to stop Rome. They would kill Roman soldiers. They were known as the daggermen. They'd go in crowds, quickly pop a Roman soldier in between his armor, kill him, and then move off into the crowd. They were the kind of the Black Panthers of the Middle East at the time. I mean, they were an activist group that was also militant. They weren't just political. They weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. So you have Simon the Zealot. And then last but not least is Judas, the son of James. He's not, I guess not last of the apostles who actually lived for Christ. He's also known as Jude or Thaddeus. We see Thaddeus in the other Gospels. Later in history, he'll be known as St. Jude or St. Thaddeus. But Jude, because Judas is always tied with Judas Iscariot. And so he was chopped up with an axe, is how he was killed. And then on our text, but I didn't even get a picture of him, I didn't think he was worth it, is Judas Iscariot, who hangs himself, or he's hanged there later in the Gospel. Iscariot would mean of Kiryat. He's from the town of Kiryat, which is down in Judea. He's the only Judean in the group. Everyone else is a Galilean. Why mention all these deaths and all these gruesome deaths and even have some of these pictures, old artistic renderings? It's because these men believed in Jesus Christ. They believed in his message. They believed in the resurrection. These men were killed in such ways, sawn in half, skinned alive, pinned to the ground, because they were being asked to deny the resurrection. This story about this teacher who rose from the dead was bad news bearers for the Jews and for the Romans. They did not want the message of Christianity to spread, and so they tried to get the leaders to deny it. But one of the things that testifies of the resurrection of Jesus is the fact that these men went to their death holding fast to the testimony of the resurrection. Now, some may say, well, many people die for what they believe. Look at like a kamikaze soldier, or even better, maybe it would be a jihadist Muslim. They die for their faith. The difference is that a jihadist today who blows himself up, they die for what they think is true. I don't deny their belief that they think it's true, but these men were there with Jesus. If it hadn't been true, they would have known it was a lie. Does that make sense? See, someone today doesn't know what happened to Muhammad. Someone doesn't know about the past. These guys knew exactly what the truth was, and if they had known it was a lie, they really were dedicated. And they were all killed in different places all over the globe at this point. Some went to Syria, some went to India, some went up north into Russia and in Germania, some were down into Africa. So they were killed all over. So it wasn't like they had to put up a good show for their friends. But they held true to the testimony because they believed it was true. And all these men, like we read of Matthew last week and of Peter last week, they forsook all. When they forsook their lives, they had already died. Matthew didn't die when he was beheaded. He died when he left the tax office. Peter didn't die in Rome. He died in his boat on the Galilee when he fell to his knees and said, "Lord, depart from me, a sinner." He already died. No longer did he live, but Christ lived in him. And the life that he lived in the flesh, he lived to give glory to the Son of God. Now, there's one last thing we're going to close on. This is actually very early and short for us compared to normal, and that was intentional, kind of. It played out really well to my advantage. I breezed right over verse 12. It came to pass in those days that he went out to a mountain to pray and continued all night in prayer to God. Prayer is something that just gets overlooked so much in the church these days. And it is something that brings so much power. The other morning, as I did a morning devotion on Acts, we were just talking about revivals and how every revival in history has started in a prayer meeting. There's none that I know of that didn't. In a specific prayer meeting, not just, pre-service prayer or praying after the end of the service, but a dedicated time in prayer to the Lord. I have only ever heard an audible word or two from the Lord in times of prayer, dedicated, focused prayer. Jesus prayed through the night before making this decision. Before he decided to pick these 12 men or get that firm confirmation from God, he prays through the entire night. There are very few people today who have ever actually prayed straight through the night. And to those who have, I'd love to challenge and ask, have they done it since the first time they did it? And have they ever done it alone without everyone else knowing that they did it? It's one thing to stay up with your buddies and pray through the night. It's another thing just to do it because you're seeking the Lord. And it's just about you and him and your prayers. We flipped to Mark in the parallel, but last week we saw the parallel where it says Jesus got up a long time before the sun. He arose long before the sun and began praying. Dedicated time in prayer. This morning, trying to fit my normal prayer time in, along with message prep and along with getting ready for church, and it made me share on Facebook, and I haven't got a lot of hits or feedback or thoughts. I said, I wonder, do you guys think Jesus skipped his devos on Shabbat, on the days that he'd go to synagogue? Well, I'm going to church today, so I can skip prayer time. I can skip my morning devo because I'm going to go to church. I know none of you would ever do that, but other less spiritual people might have this feeling that if I'm going to church today, then I can skip my normal Bible time. But I have a real strong feeling Jesus didn't do that. I have a strong feeling that he was showing up to synagogue prepared for God to use him and for God to move. And so he probably spent just as much time as any day in prayer, seeking the Lord. And so, although I've picked a selection of songs like normal for our Sunday nights, tonight I don't know how many songs we'll do, and I want to spend more time in prayer together. Some of you guys further back, you might move a little closer just so we can hear each other, but let's do this now, and let's seek the Lord and just ask him to bless this night.